are on ophtalksbooks. I'm here with my guest speakers, Georgia Loadsman and Caitlin Hickey, who have also been inspired to complete this assignment. Today, we are going to discuss our critical and imaginative pieces and why doing these links to literary worlds and imagined worlds of upheaval. Throughout my process of creating these texts and engaging with real and imagined worlds, I think I managed to reappraise and reinforce my values, as well as develop my thinking and writing skills. Woo! Let's get started.
Hi Soph, thanks for having me. Wow, happy to be here. Soph, what have you gained from your immersion in literary worlds?
Content-wise, I specifically engaged with how literary worlds have clarified for me the relationship between the individual and collective, and the responsibility one holds to the other. I think I've reconsidered how interlinked the two are, and can better grasp my capacity for positively affecting the collective as an individual, rather than just how the collective has affected me. I think, specifically, Metropolis encouraged this reappraisal in showing how individuals can be impactful, rather than 1984, which, with Winston's indoctrination on a surface level, suggests rebellion might be ineffectual in the face of more powerful and abusive regimes.
And why do you think literary worlds are so necessary?
Well, they allow us to be more self-aware and socially conscious beings by expanding on the nuances of humanity. I know I have, and still probably am, guided a bit too much by my initial judgments of others, and sometimes don't realise that we humans are not fixed entities, but can actually evolve in our worldviews to be more open-minded and less prejudiced. I think 1984 and To Kill a Mockingbird both display characters that intentionally or unintentionally display negative attitudes which they either challenge or hold alongside positive views. I think then, literary worlds respond to grey areas of good and evil in humanity, certainly establishing to me that we are capable of growth.
Yes, I agree. So what motivated you to choose the literary worlds that you did?
I specifically chose the literary worlds of the speculative and dystopian The Handmaid's Tale and 1984. I felt these texts were more demonstrative of the abusive rights occurring during the author's period of writing, while also pertaining relevance in being a cautionary tale to us of the consequences of failing to act today. Literary worlds are important in reflecting the historical context they were conceived in, to humanise the sufferings of others. I think it is through experiencing actual stories of people's rights being abused and the extensive impact this has on individuals that we can better empathise with victims and understand why protecting our own rights and fighting injustice is so important. So Georgia, how did you engage with literary worlds in your response?
Well, Soph, I have recognised that literary worlds are not stagnant in time, but rather they draw connections between events in the past, the events of the literary world, and the context of the audience. By looking closely at Madeleine Tien's novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, I understood that the literary world of her text interprets the historical world that she describes in a way that makes it accessible for the audience to relate to the emotions such as fear and anger and loss felt by the characters. I found that this is particularly true for literary worlds in texts which describe worlds of upheaval, as the audience of these texts is often unaware of what it is like to live through this world, and as such, by engaging in the literary world, they are exposed to the concerns and conflicts of another time and place that they would not be able to relate to through facts and statistics alone. Tien uses characterization to show the effects of the Cultural Revolution on the characters of Sparrow, Zai, and Zuli. This is true because, as Margaret Atwood says, what we want hasn't changed for thousands of years. Because as far as we can tell, the human template hasn't changed either, meaning that the basic human desires, the human condition, hasn't changed and never will. Literary worlds simply provide a time or genre context through which these desires can be represented in different ways. You know, I initially struggled to respond to the stimuli. Caitlin, how did you manage it?
The stimuli were really useful to further my understanding of the consistency between our current literary worlds and older ones, and therefore human nature itself by extension. The Atwood extract explicitly stated this. Human desires have remained roughly the same as the ones of our ancestor storytellers, although the specifics have changed somewhat. And Woolf's essay, although it was written 100 years ago, some of the ideas in it still prevail today. like how adaptations rarely reflect well on either the adaptation material or the movie, and the power of expressionism and abstractism when it comes to portraying emotions of the characters. Like in the fairly recent Mother, where a disturbing scene of murder, arson, and cannibalism is used to convey the relationship between many things, a creator and the fans, human nature, and humans and God. The beauty of these films is that they have potential for interpretation, and thusly can speak deeply to a number of audience members, even if they don't all agree on what it was about. Overall, these extracts presented some very interesting ideas about the purpose of literary worlds and how they've changed to remain the same over time. So, how did you incorporate the pieces that were given?
So essentially, I decided to write my form in a blog post, as I felt it more naturally allowed me to incorporate the words of Margaret Atwood, Elaine de Botton, and Virginia Woolf into my line of argument, rather than it feeling stilted and out of place in an essay. Georgia, how did you respond to the stimuli given?
Well, so, by reading other authors' thoughts on literary worlds, such as Elaine de Botton, Margaret Atwood, and Virginia Woolf, I have learned that texts allow for the audience to reflect on human behaviour. While this is true for all literary worlds, as the characters contained within them all experience different emotions, which are common to the collective human race, it is especially true for texts which contain worlds of upheaval. These show the ways in which humans cope in difficult circumstances, and whether they react well or not is entirely up to the audience on which to reflect. As Margaret Atwood says, we want to be good, therefore we tell ourselves warning stories that deal with the shadow side of our other wants. I have also recognised through my exploration of texts in recent months that my understanding of how literary worlds allow the audience to reflect on the behaviour of the collective and themselves by representing conflicts and concerns common to all people through specific individual characters in depth. Though I do believe that Virginia Woolf phrased this much more concisely than I ever could by stating, to endow one man with the attributes of the race, I recognise this idea within Metropolis, in which worker 11811 is used as a representative for all the other workers, displaying the desperation to improve his life and all other workers would have also been feeling. I know, Soph, that you were really conscientious regarding your form. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, Georgia. For my critical format, I chose a blog post to more openly engage with literary worlds that affected me, using personal pronouns to interweave my own opinions and show how these worlds provoked me to deeper thought. The blog post was certainly a new format for me, as I am definitely more comfortable writing strictly analytically. But I believe I have succeeded in this new medium to balance analytical and more informal and colloquial language.
I personally used a more formal structure because I felt that would better encapsulate my ideas and allow me to convey them in a more succinct way. Why did you use a blog form over an essay format?
Doing the 1,000 words this way, I think worked better for the digital format, as it made more sense to me to include interactive elements than if I had done a straight essay. For me, I found the blog post easier to include my own experiences and what I have gained from literary worlds, and I felt that for online readers it would be more engaging. My use of rhetorical questions and inclusive pronouns, I think, would better invite readers to consider ideas from their own experiences rather than them feeling disconnected from big slabs of text.
So then, how did you manage to relate the module to your critical?
The whole point of the module's literary worlds and worlds of upheaval, for me, is to see how texts provoke deeper thought, emotional responses, and actual tangible actions in readers and watchers. And I think my chosen format was more in line with this intention. To further reinforce ideas contained in the syllabus, I made sure to organically drop terminology and engage with ideas such as the individual and collective, and personal, social, historical, and cultural contexts that are directly referenced in the syllabus.
Hey Georgia, what were your intentions behind the form of your critical response?
Well, Caitlin, I chose to create an extract of an audiobook, as I believed that this would be an engaging form in which to present my ideas. I was able to use variation in tone and timing to maintain an engaging piece that I hope will keep the audience interested in what I have to say. The audiobook also allowed me to tie in my critical response to literary worlds by making the essay almost a literary world in itself.
Caitlin, what did you learn from writing the critical?
During my critical discussion, I reflected on the capacity of literary worlds to educate people on certain issues and perspectives, therefore inspiring change by changing the worldview of their audience. By opening the audience up to different beliefs, literary worlds encourage them to take a closer look at their own beliefs and their own world, spreading positive change as the audience are able to realise the morals of the story in their own lives. And I also learnt the way that literary worlds are able to portray new perspectives to their audience. In fact, they almost have a duty to do so. This has become more obvious in recent years, when many creators are encouraged to include the perspectives of marginalised groups, or some representation of them, in their work, particularly in children's content, to ingrain in the audience that these groups are capable of the same emotions and experiences that they are, and normalise things that are currently stigmatised.
For me, I think writing the critical composition and engaging with literary worlds has allowed me to reflect on the position of privilege I am in today, and motivated me to be less passive in challenging corrupt regimes. Thanks guys for giving me insight on your compositions.
No problem, Soph. Your work was inspiring. I think it deserves a Pulitzer.
Yes, sir. I'm your biggest fan. You deserve your own reality show. Well, thanks, guys.
I, for one, have already got framed copies of both your works on my wall.
But what about the imaginative composition? So, did you have any deliberate choices with this?
For my creative composition, I deliberately decided to make it cohesive with my critical, having themes of the individual and collective obvious throughout both, allowing myself to attack the complex relationship of individual and society through multiple formats. Creative writing is not something I'm super comfortable with, or comfortable with at all. I think because you have to put a lot of yourself and your own values into it, and incorporate ideas more subtly for it to be actually fluent and engaging, I guess. How did you respond, Caitlin, to the unit of Worlds of Upheaval?
Through considering literary worlds involving upheaval in this unit, I've been made more aware that in times of upheaval, people have a tendency to turn to naive hope about the future instead of facing their bleak reality. In the past, this has been more surrounding religion, like in Metropolis. There's lots of religious symbolism in the film, especially focused on Freda, the mediator, as a Christ figure. The ending of the film, bringing together the head and the hands, implies that through Freda, the society and the class difference will be fixed, but we know that class struggle is often much harder to fix than just solidarity between the leaders, so it's not extremely likely that the ending will actually solve the issue. The workers who are struggling through awful working conditions turn to Maria as a source of hope. She's depicted as a kind of biblical prophet, predicting Freda's arrival and role as the mediator. They mostly turn to hoping that someone else will fix their society's problems rather than fixing it themselves, and their eventual attempt to fix it goes horribly wrong and results in their children almost drowning.
In terms of responding to literary worlds in my imaginative composition, I tried to subtly include 1984, which I think worked because at this point Orwell and the novel are so iconic it wouldn't be out of place to be referenced in this sort of conversation. Referencing the dystopias in 1984 and Animal Farm also allowed me to fact-check the assumption that communism is the root of these societies, and according to some, all evil, when it is actually the perversion of socialist values and totalitarianism that sees exploitation. Additionally, I tried to incorporate some philosophical thinking, with my dumb character incorrectly referencing Karl Marx in his condemnation of being concerned about the collective, and with my female character Eliza referencing Immanuel Kant's philosophy in saying that people are not merely a means but an end in themselves. I ended my piece slightly inspired by 1984, with goodness and empathy failing to win out over the destructiveness of the regime, or in this case, my one cruel character, to evoke further frustration in readers, to encourage them not to be superficial and solipsistic, and to instead act out against this behaviour, as Eliza does. Even as she does not succeed in changing Alexander's mind, that doesn't diminish the selflessness and value of her holding true to her beliefs and being brave enough to voice them in uncomfortable circumstances.
Interesting. Georgia, how do you reference literary worlds in your composition?
Well, Caitlin, one of the ways in which I did that was to reference the many novels currently on the market about cryogenics, such as Zero K and Cryoburn. I did this through my plot by having Miss Ojeda influenced to fund the development of cryogenic technology through the reading of a novel. I also attempted to create some intertextuality through the name Ojeda, which is a play on the character's name from Altered Carbon, Ortega. This novel and television series explores the concept and consequences of effective immortality, and I was hoping that incorporating references to this literary world of upheaval that any members of the audience who had previously engaged with this world of altered carbon in the past would be able to recognise a more in-depth understanding of the concept of cryogenics that is just too difficult to incorporate into a short story. But how did you incorporate the stimulus into your writing, Caitlin?
Well, curiously, unlike in Metropolis, in Valentine's our new religion or source of hope is science. This is evident through the extract from Atwood's Cryogenics, a Symposium, where in her imaginary world, the environment is in devastation, they're strip mining the ocean to make a golf course, and the characters in focus are content to mention these things offhandedly and eat sea bass. Character A also demonstrates the same naivety as the characters in Metropolis. But instead of relying on religion as a source of hope, they turn to science. They firmly believe that cryogenics are a viable option for a sort of semi-immortality or escapism from the issues of their times, even though our current science regards it as more fiction than fact, and their friends bring up several issues with the plan. Even when their plan is actively being rebutted, A just waves the points aside with assumptions that the scientists will have worked it all out by then. This is the same sort of philosophy as a religious one, only the Messiah figure has been replaced with future scientific development. What about you, Georgia?
By reading Margaret Atwood's short story, I gained a few ideas which I chose to include in my creative composition to add depth and meaning to my piece. Though it isn't strongly referenced in my creative, I wanted to explore the idea that it may be unethical to introduce someone who is unaccustomed to today's society into a world with different societal values. I did this by writing about the more shallow concept of Naive not being able to wear her favourite type of shoes, when the people around her in the future would see her as an outsider. I gained the idea to incorporate these concepts from Margaret Atwood's piece by her reference to the environment being straightened out by the time the main character had woken up, and the sense of judgment she portrays in saying, "I wouldn't want to climb in the sack with something like that." A major theme of my short story is the idea that access to immortality is determined by wealth. Miss Ojeda says, anything is real when you have enough money. This explores the idea that when someone is wealthy, they have the ability to live in comfort and acquire all that they desire, which echoes the ideas proposed by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That once someone has enough power to cover things like food and shelter, they start searching for more, or in this case, immortality. This idea came from the statement, "Right now, all I can afford is the head," in Atwood's piece. I also explored ideas in Cryogenics, a Symposium, such as environmental ethics, in my reference to animal testing. I also explored the idea of short and long-term consequences of flash freezing people, such as the ethics of freezing someone. What the company did to Neve was effectively murder, as they did not have the ability to wake her up again. And whether Neve would wake up with her mind and personality intact, or would she be a completely different person, or even a person at all? Sophie?
Wow, Georgia, that was really deep. I don't know if it was a little risque not to engage specifically with the cryogenics and science fiction aspect of the Atwood piece we were meant to respond to, because I didn't really know enough about the topic and it isn't really something that I'm interested in. Instead, I responded to the interplay between deep philosophical concepts and general shallowness and superficiality in the excerpt, as well as our tendency to think about the superficial impact of our decisions rather than their greater impact on humanity. I did this in having an intelligent and reflective character engage in conversation with someone who is more rigid and short-term in their views, and a bit of a douchebag. The form itself, in having a back and forward conversation for a large part of it, was inspired by the dialogue in Atwood's piece, even as I felt it necessary to include the characters' thoughts and actions to flesh out my ideas.
Now, in terms of form, I tried to emulate Margaret Atwood's form of dialogue in Cryogenics, a Symposium, by writing the court case segments of the story as a dialogue between the judge and the accused, with no description in between. I contrasted this with the prose of Neve's perspective to emphasise the different perspectives of the corporate against the individual. For Neve's perspective, I tried to create a textbook-like style to convey a sense that the individual's perspective, desires, concerns and conflicts are lost when trying to compete with the collective voice of powerful people. By breaking up the perspectives and slotting them together, I tried to create a contrast between the two perspectives, showing both how Miss Ojeda and Neve see the world and the situation they are in. For example, I write that Miss Ojeda explains, "I think she wanted the immortality," when in fact Neve says she chose to be frozen because she was threatened with the death of her newborn baby. Towards the end, I made each of these sections shorter to create suspense for the audience. Soph, I noticed your creative response included some reference to gender imbalance. Would you like to elaborate on that?
So, in light of the Me Too movement and intersectional feminism, the douchebag character also exhibited the sexist tendency of mansplaining and being condescending and a tad inappropriate to his young female employee, which we see her struggle to respond to. I think that continually shining a light on power imbalances, not just between genders, but in all working relationships, will help us to be more self-aware regarding our treatment of others in the workplace, or for me and us in the classroom. My creative composition in this way responded to real-world issues of power imbalances, and our tendency again to judge people on their exteriors. As I mentioned before, like in my critical, I dealt with a relationship between the individual and collective that we struggle with in the real world. My boss character typically believes that he doesn't owe anything to the world, that he is self-made in his success and is beyond brilliant for having contributed anything at all to greater society. Through the perspective of my female character, we then see her internally and outwardly point out the hypocrisy of this and how we do in fact owe it to ourselves and humanity to contribute to a safe and happy society. And likewise, humanity owes that to us. In trying to encourage her boss towards empathy, she also references the real figures of Van Gogh and Bill Gates to relate to Alexander and show the character Alexander and show how success isn't quantified by wealth. I further reference the real worlds of China and Russia, where an overemphasis on the collective has infringed on individual rights, and I again address this in my blog post. Also stressing how overemphasis on the individual can lead to oligarchism and a lack of community. You can see my boss character as a product of this.
Hey Soph, I was wondering how you used language features and characterization to communicate ideas and your overall purpose?
The characters I had were both caricatures, with the boss character having an overemphasized lack of intelligence, understanding, and an engorged ego, and I used him as an unreliable narrator, while making it obvious that the reader is meant to loathe him. Whereas the intern is probably a bit unrealistic in her openly challenging her supervisor. I still try to subvert expectations a bit though, to challenge the old assumption that wealth and power equal intelligence, a capacity for understanding and essentially worth. The boss character, who might externally appear to be wise, charismatic, and worldly, is actually less intelligent than the outwardly dorky and flustered college student. I used the extended metaphor of his office being cavernous to reflect the contents of his mind. In the dispositions of the two characters, I also contrasted the finance mogul's lack of reflection or self-awareness, tending to jump into situations and say things without thinking about it, with a more pensive and reflective female character, stressing to readers the importance of thinking again how outward appearances don't necessarily denote what's inside. These characters show how we need to address the world of upheaval we are living in today. What do you think is the main point of upheaval in the 21st century, Caitlin?
I think upheaval is mainly created by environmental destruction, in particular global warming, like in the extract. For my imaginative piece, I extrapolated this into a world of upheaval, in which the only point of hope for its citizens is the colonization of Mars. I used biblical allusion, explicitly in the case of the name, to parallel the terraforming robot with a messiah figure, specifically the second coming, where humanity's actions were being judged as to whether they would continue to eternal life or an extended one in paradise, or at least that's how my narrator envisions it. My protagonist says watching the robot land feels like their lives were being weighed in the balance, and being found wanting is the unspoken conclusion to that thought. The name Genesis references the first chapter of the Bible, obviously. This specifically refers to the beginning of a new world, and subconsciously, a world that's fallen to ruin through the sins of its forefathers. This presents the implication that the Martian colony, whether or not it will exist, will not be the idealistic paradise that the residents of Earth hope for. This is also foreshadowed by the passing of clouds over the sun just before Genesis begins to land. Although the clouds appear bright and beautiful, they still block the sun, just like how Mars appears to the protagonist. The central concept to my imaginative piece is the theme of redemption and whether earning it is necessary. In my story, humans have destroyed the Earth beyond all repair, and yet they're still, by science, being offered redemption in the form of an entirely new planet and their new lives on it, even though they may not deserve one after they damaged the first one so badly. In my story, Humans have destroyed the Earth beyond all repair, and yet they're still, by science, being offered redemption in the form of an entirely new planet and new lives on it, even though they may not deserve one after they damaged the first one so badly. Particularly towards the end of the story, my protagonist thinks often about the concept of deserving a second chance. She says that she thinks they do, we deserve to survive, but her final line, please, suggests otherwise, that she understands that in the end, humanity doesn't really deserve a second chance, but they want one. The please at the end is also reminiscent of a prayer, which ties back to the religious illusions, and therefore they should get one, in her opinion. My story aims to question whether deserving a second chance is a prerequisite of getting one, and whether it's self-centered to assume that humanity deserves one, considering our treatment of the Earth. Although the characters imagine that life on Mars will be better, and that they'll learn from their mistakes, it seems likely that the cycle will repeat itself yet again, and that their hope, unbeknownst to my character at the time of the story, was as naive as belief in divine intervention.
Georgia, what's the purpose of your story?
The purpose of my story was to explain to the audience that any changes in technology now will have lasting impacts into the future. As explained within my critical response, literary worlds connect moments in time for the audience, evaluating the impacts of decisions made. Madeleine Tien also explores this idea in her novel when she writes, I assumed that when Big Mother's stories finished, life would continue and I would go back to being myself. But it wasn't true. The stories got longer and longer, and I got smaller and smaller. In saying this, she explains the importance of stories and how they can change an individual's world. I hope that by writing my story, I'm able to create a sense of this, for good, within my audience's mind. Another purpose of writing my story was to expand my own ability to understand and create literary worlds that display worlds of upheaval in new and interesting ways. By exploring other literary worlds, I have understood ways in which I can learn from their form and language techniques, such as Margaret Atwood's experimentation with dialogue and the dramatic techniques in Metropolis, a form in which I have very little experience, but a lot of interest. In addition to this, during the creation of my story, I was able to appraise my own ability and motivation to write stories, particularly those about worlds of upheaval. I think I've been able to do this effectively by experimenting with form and characterization, as I've not written a perspective that is just comprised of dialogue before this assessment task. I have grown in my ability to create literary worlds that centre around worlds of upheaval.
Overall, in the process of creating our imaginative pieces and critical pieces, we've been reminded of the worth of the world and the value of worlds of upheaval. I hope that stories like ours will continue to motivate people to think more deeply on complex issues, provoking us to action. Wow, this has been such an interesting discussion. I feel I have reappraised my own values through engaging with literary worlds. How about you, Caitlin and Georgia?
Yes, Sophie, it has been truly inspiring to bathe in your golden aura, Sophie Howard.
We're not able to fully comprehend your omnipotent being.
Oh shucks, you guys are alright too. Next week on ophtalksbooks, I'll shed my mortal flesh and ascend to godhood. Also, we'll have Oprah and Beyonce talking about feminism. See you all for now.